Hello and welcome to Sake Revolution, America's first sake podcast. I am your host, John Puma, sake nerd at large and the founder of SakeNotes.com and the administrator of the Internet Sake Discord.
And I'm your host, Timothy Sullivan. I'm a sake samurai, sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And together, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake.
That's right. And Tim, you know what? When I speak to people who are new to sake, I often get the same question every time.
Well, what's that?
They ask me about, Tim, unfiltered sake.
Hulk smash! Sorry, that was my inner Bruce Banner. I get very angry when someone talks to me about unfiltered sake. Let's just say that this is a pet peeve of mine, John.
All right. I did not mean to enrage the sake samurai, but I think we both know what's going to be going on in the sake education corner this week.
I knew this day has been coming. There's no way around it. We need to address the cloudy elephant in the room. Let's talk about Nigori.
All right, Tim. Let's talk about Nigori.
Were you surprised that I got so upset?
You know, I think it's the first time I've ever seen you raise your voice. You're usually so mild-mannered.
I am. It's something that I've dealt with for 15 years, and I guess it's just 15 years of pent-up Nigori anger just came out all at once.
Well, then this will be therapeutic. We need to talk this out.
Yes, let's work it out.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, John, are you a fan of Nigori sake?
Not especially, although as we talk about on the show often, with sake, there's no hard and fast rules, and there are always exceptions. So there are several Nigori that I'm very, very fond of, but it's not something I look for.
Okay, for our listeners who are just getting started with sake, how would you explain Nigori to the beginners out there?
Okay, so if you're a beginner, it's a thing that you think is unfiltered sake. But it's not unfiltered, is it, Tim?
How would you describe it?
It's cloudy.
It's cloudy, right.
It's cloudy sake.
I think most people who've gone to a sushi restaurant and ordered sake, whether they got it themselves or not, most people, I think, have seen this milky-white, cloudy sake out there. In Japanese, we call it Nigori. And in English, we call it coarsely-filtered sake. And there's one thing we never call it. Unfiltered
sake.
Okay, I'll admit we're getting into pet peeve territory again, but
it's okay. We're here to talk. It's all right.
Yes. This is a safe space. This is a safe sake space. Yeah. So I have to admit, I understand why people call it unfiltered. If you pick up the bottle, there's all this white cloudy sediment in there. And it looks like it could be something that's unfiltered. But we know that it's not unfiltered. And do you know why that is?
I don't think you're allowed to not filter your sake.
That is correct. There is a law in Japan to legally sell your product as sake. Mm-hmm. It must pass through a filter. If it doesn't pass through a filter of some kind, you can't legally sell it as sake. So everything we drink that is legally sold as sake, nihonshu, goes through a filter if it comes from Japan.
So if you don't put it through the filter, what is it then?
Well, that is like completely unadulterated sake mash. So that's like drinking sake right out of the tank,
right? And
completely unprocessed. And there's actually a name for that. It's called Doburoku.
Ah, yes. I am somewhat, very tangentially familiar with Doburoku.
Something tells me from that comment you've had a Doburoku before.
Tim, I've definitely had a Doburoku before. My wife really enjoys Doburoku, and regardless of how much she enjoys it, I do my best not to chide her about it because it's very much not my thing.
So how would you explain Doburoku to somebody? It's a very unique thing.
I would say Doburoku. When I describe Doburoku to somebody, it is, oh, it's this sake with big chunks of rice in it.
Yep.
And that's the visual that I want people to have in their head when they think of it. So if you're somebody who has thought that Nigori was unfiltered, if you saw this stuff, you would never make that mistake again, because this is truly what unfiltered looks like.
Yes. I call Doburoku the sake you can eat with a fork.
I've never tried it.
It's got big chunks of rice in there.
It does.
And it's like, you know, if you're tired of drinking it, you could get out your fork and start eating it. That's how chunky it is, people. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
And Doburoku is actually something that is pretty rare in Japan. It's not allowed to be brewed regularly. You need a special license to sell Doburoku in Japan. Usually, small towns might have a Doburoku festival, or a shrine might be making Doburoku for a religious ceremony. So there's some reasons where you can get your hands on Doburoku, but it's really, really pretty rare. And it is the chunkiest of chunky, and it is really, truly unfiltered sake.
All right. And I don't think we really get that here, do we?
No, I haven't seen it here.
Yeah, me either.
But I'm okay with that.
I don't mind.
So that brings us back around to proper Nigori, or cloudy sake, or coarsely filtered sake. But we do not call it unfiltered.
So coarsely filtered, so it is still being filtered, but they're kind of letting a little bit more through, and that's what we see in the bottle?
That's right.
Okay.
There's different ways you can make Nigori happen. One is to use a coarse fabric. When you press the sake, little bits of rice starch get through the weave and end up. Some breweries press the sake clear and then take some of the leftover kasu, the leftover pressings, and mix them back into the clear sake and make it cloudy that way. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And some people use a very, very coarse filter if they want a super chunky sake. There's a wide range of thicknesses to Nigori as well. Have you heard of usu Nigori before?
I have. I actually really enjoy most usu Nigori, mostly because they tend to taste a little bit fresher to me. Usu Nigori is very light Nigori, so it's, there's not a lot of sediment in there, and I don't think it influences the flavor or the texture of the sake as much as it does a Nigori. But I think that when sake comes over to the United States, I think we've mentioned in our Nama episode that in transit it sometimes loses a little something. It changes a little bit. And in my experiences, the Usu Nigori, sometimes it retains a little bit of that because of the solids. I'm not sure if that's purely in my head, but it is definitely something that I've felt like I experienced before.
Yeah, there's a whole range of different weights to Nigori. So I think Usu Nigori is where you have, like, as you said, the lightest kind of little bit of a wisp of sediment in there. Then you can have a medium-bodied to thicker-bodied, and on the far spectrum is that Doburoku, that completely unfiltered sake. That's
opaque.
Yes. Yeah. So what? Well, let's talk turkey for a second. Why do you think?
Sure.
Why do you think Nigori is so popular with Americans? Because I agree with you. When I talk to people about sake, I go to a cocktail party, I meet people. What do you do? Oh, I'm a sake teacher. Oh my God, I love unfiltered sake. I hear it all the time. Why do you think cloudy sake is so popular with Americans?
I mean, I think it probably because it's different. It is unusual, and I think that when people are thinking about sake, part of what draws them to wanting to try it is that it's a little exotic. And I think that when they see that, it's a lot exotic. And so that maybe attracts people who otherwise would look at regular sake and think it was a little boring looking.
Yeah. I also think that Nigori sake tends to be sweeter. It's not true for every Nigori, but the rice starch, when it hits your tongue, the enzymes in your saliva convert that to sugar right away. So you do, in some Nigoris, you do get a burst of sweetness when you sip on it. I think the American palate is really skewed towards sweetness.
That makes sense.
Having grown up consuming my weight in Halloween candy every October as a child, I think I know where that comes from. But yeah, and I learned recently that, did you know McDonald's French fries are soaked in corn syrup before they're deep fried? I had never heard that before.
I have never heard that before either.
Yeah, I was on YouTube and I was looking at this recipe for how to recreate McDonald's French fries at home. You know, this is kind of quarantine food culture happening, but I was like, oh my gosh, they soak it in corn syrup and then they fry it. So there's sugar in everything in our culture.
Yeah,
so
there really is. There really is.
I think the sweetness aspect to it is an attraction to a lot of people. And the other thing that I think is that the texture is so interesting. You know, clear sakes can be very clean appearing on the palate, some almost water-like, but Nigori has some real texture to it.
It definitely does, especially when you, as you mentioned, there are plenty of different gradients of of Nigori. It is not simply, it's always this amount. Are there any? Definitely, I mean, I would imagine not here in the States, but in Japan, apart from Usu Nigori and Doburoku being on the other end, do they have formalized names for different types?
No, I would say I've heard descriptors like, thick Nigori, medium Nigori, light Nigori, but there's not a set industry codified vocabulary that's used. Usu Nigori is the one term that people really embrace as an industry-wide term for that very light Nigori.
Interesting. All right. So, in my travels, and I often confuse this with Usu Nigori, especially when I'm overseas. I encounter origarami.
Yes.
So where does that fit into all of this?
Well, ori is the word for the very fine particulate that is remaining in sake after pressing. So after it goes through the sake press, there's fine particulate, and normally you would let that settle out. So you take sake for about 10 days to 2 weeks and you let it sit in a tank, and all that fine particulate floats to the bottom. That's called racking in the wine world, where you pull off the clean sake and let all that sediment settle down. But if you leave that ori, that fine sediment, in there, you have origarami sake. So it leaves that very trace amount of fine sediment. So it's similar to Usu Nigori in that it's on the spectrum of being the much lighter side of what we would consider a Nigori.
So Tim, one thing I did notice when I'm over in Japan, though, I don't see nearly as much Nigori as I see other types of sake. And remember, people in the United States are constantly asking for the U word. So is it just like really popular here, or like is it not as popular there, or is it all sold out when I get there? What's going on?
Nigori is very popular here in the States, but in Japan, there's a little bit of cultural baggage associated with Nigori. Nigori is not as popular in the market in Japan.
Why is that?
Well, when sake was first made in Japan, it was cloudy and rough and not finely filtered. And when they introduced filtering technology, only the elite people with status, the emperor and the royal court, they were the first people to get clear sake or filtered sake. So it became very associated with high status and refinement, literal refinement. And so clear filtered sakes really gained favor as something that's more elegant, more preferred, and cloudy sakes took on a real country bumpkin, unsophisticated kind of rough and ready air to them. So that cultural stigma has kind of lingered related to Nigori sake. But in the U.S., we don't have any of that history or any of that understanding. So Nigori, clear, it's all kind of on equal footing. So Americans, I think, tend to enjoy either one and not think twice about it. In Japan, there is this little bit of leftover cultural baggage about what it means to have a cloudy sake versus a clear sake.
That reminds me a little bit of the junmai versus the non-junmai conversation that we had, where even though sake used added alcohol for many years, and it was only in the 70s that law was lifted, now everybody is pure rice, or let me rephrase that, now that's very popular and trendy.
That is such a smart observation. I really agree with you. There's been, for a long time, added alcohol was the way it was done, and then they brought back pure rice style, and then some people thought like, oh, this has to be better. And in reality, you can enjoy both styles, but there are some people who have a bias towards the junmai or the pure rice style. And there's actually some breweries that only make junmai style sakes. They won't even make the alcohol added style.
And there's bars that I've seen in Japan that only serve the junmai style, and it is part of their slogan is we only serve pure rice sake.
Yeah, and I think that in relation to cloudy versus clear and junmai versus alcohol added, my honest feeling is that the more variety, the better. And I think that people should enjoy the widest variety they can and try all different styles. I always say there's a lid for every pot. There's a food pairing for every sake, and there is a way to enjoy the widest variety. Even if it's not your favorite for everyday drinking, I think that there can be a food pairing or some way of enjoying it that's going to grab just about everyone. So I want people to enjoy a wide variety.
So, even though Nigori is not my favorite kind of sake, all this talk of Nigori has me wanting to have some Nigori.
There's no way around it.
Tim, no, we're going to need to confront this.
We have to dive right in.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we both introduce the Nigori picks that we brought for today?
Sure. Tim, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I have a sake that I remember from my very first days of getting into sake 15 years ago. So I know this is one of the sakes I had the very first year I started drinking sake. So it's been exported for a long time. It's called Rihaku Nigori. It's a tokubetsu junmai, and the English name for this is Dreamy Clouds. That's a very evocative.
That's a good name.
Yes.
I like that.
This sake is from Shimane Prefecture. It's a Gohyaku Mangoku sake rice, and our rice milling rate is 65%.
Nice. Well, I brought something along that's very local.
Local?
Local. So recently, right after the lockdowns started, Kato Sake Works opened up in Brooklyn, and they make a Nigori that they simply call Nigori. They also say hazy in quotes, but I believe the title of the sake is just Nigori, and it uses Calrose milled down to 60%.
All right. So we've got domestic Nigori and an imported Nigori.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and open mine up. Now, when you open a Nigori, one mistake I see people make sometimes is that they don't invert their bottle. So Nigori is all that sediment, and if the bottle has been standing undisturbed for a while, the sediment is going to settle down to the bottom, and you'll have it all collected at the bottom of the bottle. So it's important to gently invert the bottle before you open it and distribute that sediment back around through the bottle. I've gone to some restaurants where I've ordered a Nigori and the waiter opened the bottle and started pouring, and it came out relatively clear. And I'm like, I know this is a cloudy sake. And the person did not invert the bottle before opening, and that's not good. So you have to be sure when you open a cloudy sake to give it a little inversion so that you can distribute those the sediment that's in there. The only caveat to that is make sure it's not a sparkling Nigori, or you're in big trouble with that.
Well, then you just very, very gently turn the bottle.
Yes.
And then very, very slowly turn it back. And then take a step back. And then you come back.
Yep. So I've got the Nigori in my wine glass. And when we look at Nigori in a clear glass, you want to see how much it sticks to the side of the glass, because you can get some Nigoris that are going to give you a very distinct coating on the side of the glass. And I'm getting some here, but it's very light. This Rihaku gives me a very light kind of coating. The thickness is medium to light bodied, but you definitely cannot see through this. So it's a solid Nigori, but it's not so chunky that it's leaving residue on the side of the glass to any great extent. I'm going to give it a smell. So it smells ricey. It smells like rice pudding, and it smells sweet too. It smells sweet. Mm-hmm. But there's that. If you made rice pudding and then you put it in the fridge and it was cold, it's kind of that smell. And I'm gonna give it a taste. So it's very creamy, coats my mouth, but at the finish you get the alcohol and a little dry bite at the end. So there's a dryness. It's not all sweetness. It's not all like marshmallow sweetness, tropical coconut flavors. There's a alcohol dryness at the end to balance out that sweetness. So nice. It's got really good balance, and it's really very drinkable. If it was any thicker than this, I think it would get into the territory that's not my personal preference. But the weight that we have going on here with the Rihaku Tokubetsu Junmai, I think is really enjoyable and really nice. Yes. Yeah, so how about you? I'm curious how the Bushwick Brooklyn sake is going to stand up to Shimane Prefecture.
Well, let's see. We do have really nice water here in New York.
We do. Best pizza, best bagels in the world.
Yeah, they tell me that's why the bagels are so good. And apparently you've heard the same thing. Apparently everybody hears the same stories. All right, so I'm pouring into my wine glass now. And this looks to be a little bit cloudier than what you described on yours, to be completely fair. It is almost opaque, and swirling around the glass does leave a little bit of residue on the side, as it should.
There's some film,
but not too much. It actually keeps to itself pretty well. Now on the nose, it's kind of like a fresh, like a grass, and also like sour apple, like a Granny Smith apple, kind of like that. Like let's say you kind of crushed up a Granny Smith apple a little bit, and then had it out for a few minutes and let the aromas really come out of it. And the taste is actually it continues that. It really goes well with the aroma. It does have that, that almost sour apple kind of flavor. When I say sour, I mean like a Granny Smith or an apple of that type.
When I think of a Granny Smith apple, I think of something that's tart. Is it like a tartness?
Oh, yes. Well, I don't think tart and sour are too far away from each other.
No, they're not. Yeah. Does it feel weighty on your palate? Because I know I can see the texture's a little bit thicker. Does it feel heavier?
Not really. we've tasted Ginjo sakes on this very show that had much more action on the mouthfeel,
Yeah.
like much thicker. This, despite it being a Nigori, does not have that thickness to it. I don't feel my mouth getting overly coated by it, although I'm sure it's happening slowly as I sip more of it. It's nice, and I think that the flavor in this is going to be kind of strong enough to deal with kind of bigger flavors too. What would have you had much experience pairing with Nigori?
Oh, I sure have. Absolutely. The word Nigori in English literally means murky or not clear. So that's really all we get when we say Nigori. And it's important to remember when we talk about food pairings that it can be anywhere along the spectrum from, you can barely see the sediment to eat it with a fork. So we could be anywhere in there. I think mine is a touch on the lighter side compared to yours. But, when you were talking about the texture of it, I was thinking, if I was blind tasting this, like if I had a blindfold on and I couldn't see it, would I know it was a Nigori? I'm hoping I would, but it's relatively light. I don't think I would be able to tell just by tasting it. That's how kind of light-bodied this one is. So when we pair food with Nigori, we have to remember that Nigoris really have more of a pronounced texture in general, and they have what we would consider more of a creamy texture. And I like to pair Nigori a couple different ways. One is with spicy food. Nigori can act like, if you have spicy Greek food, sometimes they serve that yogurt on the side that calms down the spice. And
Right.
It's similar with pairing with a Nigori. If you have a Nigori that's a little more creamy and you have something with a little, like a spicy pad thai or something, and you sip on a Nigori with that, it really calms the spice down and balances that out. And that the little bit of sweetness and the little bit of creaminess you get in Nigori can balance out a gentle spice really nicely. Not a super, super melt your face kind of spicy food, but a gentle Asian spicy dish is really good with Nigori. And briefly, the other thing that we do a lot of is dessert. So if you have a really creamy Nigori that has more of a creamy, almost pina colada texture to it, those tend to be noticeably sweeter, very, very rich and creamy. We love to pair those with dark chocolate or chocolate desserts. They pair really well because you get that kind of creamy tropical fruit coconut essence to them, and those pair really well with some desserts. Have you ever had any experience pairing these cloudy sakes with any different foods?
Occasionally, because I don't drink them as much, I have less experience, and pairing is a blind spot for me in a lot of cases. But I want to have this with. I want to have like a hamburger with this. I typically put like a little bit of horseradish and maybe some like chipotle mayo on a burger occasionally.
Yeah.
And I think this would go really well with that. And it's got me craving a little bit. I think our conversation with Chris Johnson last week left an impression on me that while I'm sipping sake, I want to be thinking about what I want to eat with it.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing that a little bit more, and this is what's popping into my head here.
So those condiments you mentioned, does that get us into a little bit of the spicy territory I was talking about?
A little bit. It's going to bring it. It's going to make them. It's going to bring it away from being, meaty, smoky, and bring it into a little bit more of a light spice to it.
Yeah. Well, one last thing I want to talk about regarding Nigori is a little bit of a cautionary tale too. So Nigori has all this sediment in it, and the sediment is the pure rice starch. So when you press the sake, the rice starch sediment that did not ferment, a little bit gets left in there, and that's what makes it cloudy. And it's important to pay attention to the bottle to make sure that doesn't discolor. Over time, you can have Nigoris that the rice starch will discolor and they'll turn a very unpleasant brown color.
Oh.
I once went to a liquor store in the Midwest. I was traveling for business. It was in the middle of nowhere, and I found a brand of Nigori that I actually like. And I picked up the bottle and I disturbed the sediment. It was a clear bottle, and it was brown as mud, and it should be white as snow. And this bottle had probably been sitting on the shelf for 4 or 5 years, just in the sun, direct sunlight. And they had it out. They had no idea something was wrong with it. And it is something to be aware of, that when you have a Nigori, you want to keep it protected from light, and you want to drink it as quickly as possible. Any discoloration to the sediment is a sign that maybe that bottle's over the hill.
I'm glad I haven't had that experience. That sounds like it would keep me away from Nigori in a big way. I don't like the idea of it turning. That's going from cloudy to stormy. We don't like that. So I think that's all about Nigori for now.
So, John, do you think we've worked out our Nigori issues?
I think we have. You had slightly larger Nigori issues than I did, but the important thing is we talked it out.
I have some post-traumatic Nigori stress. That's true. But I feel much better now after talking to you. I think there's a lot of love for Nigori out there. We just have to avoid that one word that might trigger me. But other than that, I think Nigori is something wonderful, and we should all enjoy it as much as we can.
And you're sipping a Nigori, and you're enjoying it. See?
Yes, I feel
you can. There's peace.
I feel very safe. Good. This was a good episode. This is a happy ending.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. If you can, please take a moment and rate our show on Apple Podcasts.
And to make sure that you don't miss an episode, please make sure you subscribe to our podcast. This way it just shows up on your phone whenever you're not looking.
And as always, to learn more about any of the topics or the particular sakes we've talked about in today's episode, visit our website, sakerevolution.com, and there you'll find our detailed show notes.
And, of course, we want you to send us your feedback. If you have any show ideas, people you want us to talk to, sakes you want us to drink, drop us an email anytime at feedback@sakerevolution.com. So until next time, please remember to keep drinking sake and...
Kanpai!